Cold-blooded bikers taunt a teenage girl. Her secret weapon leaves them in shock. In the drowsy shadows of twilight, the roar of motorcycles shattered the peace of the small town of Oakville. The notorious biker gang known as the Hellhounds prowled the streets, their laughter tinged with cruelty. Fear had become the currency here, with the residents scurrying into their homes and drawing their curtains tight at the first growl of the bikes. Amidst the engine's rumble, a teenage girl walked along the cracked sidewalk, her eyes downcast. Her name was Sarah, and she dreaded these evening walks home from her after-school job at the local diner. It was a short distance, but each step felt weighted with trepidation. A flurry of laughter made her head snap up. The bikers had spotted her, like wolves scenting a wounded deer. They circled her, their bikes spitting exhaust and their sneers promising humiliation. Well, what do we have here? The leader, Raven, drawled. A little mouse, scurrying home? Sarah said nothing, trying to step past them, heart thudding painfully in her chest. But they blocked her path, the semicircle tightening. Not so fast, Raven chuckled. We're just having a friendly chat, aren't we, boys? Guffaws and jeers answered him. One of them reached out, tugging hard on Sarah's ponytail, making her yelp. Tears stung her eyes as their laughter swelled. Suddenly, a voice rang out, cutting through the taunts like a blade. That's enough. The bikers turned, hands already curling into fists. But they paused at the sight of the speaker. It was a woman, tall and lean, with a military bearing that made them hesitate. Sarah felt a surge of relief as she recognized her. Evelyn Stone, the woman who had moved into the old Johnson place a few months ago. Rumors swirled about her, about the things she had seen and done during her military career. Looking at her now, the straight set of her shoulders and the steely glint in her eye, Sarah could believe every whispered story. This doesn't concern you, Raven spat, but there was a waver in his voice. I'm making it my concern, Evelyn said evenly. The stare-down held for a tense moment before Raven revved his engine. This isn't over, he snarled, pointing a finger at Sarah. Then the bikes roared away, leaving Sarah shaking in their wake. Evelyn approached, her steps measured. Up close, Sarah could see the lines on her face, the hints of the burdens she carried. But when she spoke, her voice was gentle. Are you all right? Sarah nodded jerkily, not trusting herself to speak. Evelyn's hand settled on her shoulder, the touch firm and reassuring. Let's get you home, Evelyn said, steering her down the street. And then, if you're willing, I think it's time we talk about how to deal with these hellhounds. And as they walked, Sarah felt the first stirrings of something she had almost forgotten, the tentative bloom of hope. The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the kitchen window as Sarah sat at the table, a mug of tea warming her hands. Evelyn sat across from her, her own mug untouched as she listened intently to Sarah's story. Sarah talked of the years of torment, the way the hellhounds had slowly tightened their grip on the town. She spoke of the fear that had seeped into every corner, of the helplessness that had settled like a shroud. When she finished, Evelyn was silent for a long moment. Then she leaned forward, her gaze intense. What happened to you last night? What's been happening in this town? It's not right. And it's not going to stop unless someone makes a stand. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. But what can we do? They're too strong, too ruthless. They want you to believe that, Evelyn said. But it's a lie. They're only as strong as the fear they create. She stood, moving to the window. Her posture was rigid, her voice distant as if seeing something far away. In the military, I learned that there are different kinds of strength. There's the kind that comes from violence, from intimidation. But there's another kind, a truer kind. Comes from within, from knowing what's right and being willing to fight for it. She turned back to Sarah, her eyes softening. I see that strength in you, Sarah. You stood up to them last night in your own way. That took courage. Sarah ducked her head, a flush rising to her cheeks. No one had ever said she was courageous before. Evelyn's hand settled on her shoulder. It's time this town remembered what courage looks like. And I think, with a little help, you could be the one to show them. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Me? But I'm no one special. You don't have to be special, Evelyn said with a small smile. You just have to be willing. Willing to stand up, to speak out, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. She squeezed Sarah's shoulder. Think about it. I'm here if you need me. With that, she left, the screen door swinging shut behind her. And Sarah sat, tea growing cold, thoughts swirling like leaves in a gust of wind. Could she do it? Could she be the one to stand up to the hellhounds? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a mix of fear and something else, something bright and hot and fierce. She thought of last night, of the moment when Evelyn had appeared and the balance had shifted. She thought of the way the bikers had hesitated, just for a second. Maybe Evelyn was right. Maybe it wasn't about being special. Maybe it was about being brave, about taking that first step, no matter how much your knees shook. Sarah took a deep breath, then another. And slowly, like the sun peeking through the clouds, a smile spread across her face. It was time to stop running. It was time to stand. The sun was high and hot the day Sarah walked into Mo's diner with her head held high. The usual patrons were there, hunched over their coffee and eggs, shoulders bowed under the weight of their worries. But today, Sarah wasn't scurrying to the back, eyes down. Today, she walked to the center of the room, ignoring the curious glances and the shocked whispers. Can I have everyone's attention, please? Her voice shook, but she pressed on. I have something to say. Slowly, the chatter died down. Faces turned towards her, some curious, some wary. Sarah took a deep breath. For too long, we've been living in fear. Fear of the hellhounds, fear of what they might do. We've let them control us, let them take away our peace and our dignity. She paused, her heart pounding. In the corner of her eye, she saw Evelyn, standing silently by the door, a small nod of encouragement. But we don't have to be afraid anymore. We don't have to let them win. We are stronger than they are because we have something they don't. We have each other. A murmur went through the crowd, a rustle of uncertainty. I know it's not easy. I know it's scary. But if we stand together, if we support each other, they can't touch us. Their power comes from our fear. If we stop being afraid, they lose that power. She looked around the room, meeting each gaze. Some looked away, but others held her stare. And in their eyes, she saw a glimmer of something, a spark of hope. I'm not asking for heroes. I'm just asking for neighbors, for friends, for people who are willing to look out for each other, to lend a hand when it's needed. That's how we beat them, not with violence, but with kindness, with unity. As she spoke, she felt the air in the room shift. Shoulders straightened, jaws unclenched. It was like a collective breath had been released, a weight lifted. From the back of the room, a voice called out. It was old Joe, the town's retired postmaster. The girl's right. We've been letting those hoodlums push us around for too long. It's time we pushed back. A chorus of agreement followed, voices rising in a tide of determination. Sarah felt her heart swell, tears pricking at her eyes. This was it. This was the moment she had feared and hoped for. The moment when the hellhounds ceased to be an insurmountable force and became just what they were, a bunch of bullies who could be stood up to. She sought out Evelyn's eyes, seeking reassurance. Evelyn met her gaze, a slow smile lighting her face, pride shining in her eyes. Sarah turned back to the crowd, a new strength in her stance. So, who's with me? Hands shot up, voices rang out. And in that moment, in that dingy diner in the heart of a troubled town, a revolution was born, a revolution of compassion, of courage, of community. The hellhounds had no idea what was coming. The sun had barely begun its climb into the sky when the growl of motorcycle engines shattered the morning calm. The hellhounds rode into town, anticipation thrumming through their veins. They expected the usual, the cringing fear, the hasty retreats, the downcast eyes. What they got was something entirely different. As they roared down Main Street, they were met not with silence and scurrying, but with a wall of people. Men and women, old and young, they stood shoulder to shoulder, a human barricade that brought the bikes to a stuttering halt. At the front of the crowd stood Sarah, her chin high and her eyes blazing. Gone was the trembling girl from the sidewalk. In her place was a young woman who radiated strength and purpose. Raven's eyes narrowed as he revved his engine, trying to intimidate. But the crowd didn't waver. "What's this?" he sneered. "Some kind of protest?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. "This is a warning. Your time of terrorizing this town is over. We won't be intimidated anymore." Raven barked a laugh, but there was an edge to it, a hint of unease. "You think you can stop us, little girl? You think your little crowd here scares us?" Sarah smiled, and there was steel in it. "I think it should. Look around you, Raven. Look at these people. They're not afraid of you anymore. And that's something you should fear." Raven's gaze swept the crowd, taking in the determined faces, the clenched fists. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But he couldn't back down, not now, not in front of his men. He revved his engine again, louder this time. "We'll see about that." He jerked his head, and the hellhounds began to move, trying to force their way through the crowd. But for every inch they gained, the townspeople pushed back. They linked arms, formed a chain that the bikers couldn't break. Frustration and anger mounted, tempers fraying. Raven's control over his men began to slip, their actions becoming more erratic, more violent. But the crowd held firm. They had found their courage, and they wouldn't let it go. It was old Joe who saw it first, the glint of metal in the morning sun. "He's got a gun." Raven had pulled a pistol from his jacket, waving it wildly. The crowd tensed, fear rippling through them. But before Raven could do anything more, a figure stepped out from the crowd. It was Evelyn, her stance as steady as if she were on a military parade ground. "Put the gun down, son," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "This doesn't have to end in violence." Raven's eyes were wild, the gun shaking in his hand. "Stay back. I'll shoot. I swear I will." Evelyn took a step forward, then another. "No, you won't, because deep down you know this is wrong. You know this isn't strength, it's cowardice." She was close now, close enough to touch. Slowly, she reached out, her hand settling over Raven's, over the gun. "It's over," she said softly. "It's time to let go." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Raven's fingers loosened. The gun clattered to the ground. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, as the hellhounds stood in stunned silence, the town of Oakville took its first breath of freedom. The days that followed were a time of healing, of rebuilding. The hellhounds hadn't disappeared overnight, but their power had been broken. They skulked on the edges of town, their intimidating aura diminished. But the town hadn't let its guard down. Under Evelyn's guidance and Sarah's inspiration, they had begun to organize. A neighborhood watch was formed, not to confront the bikers, but to look out for each other. People started walking in pairs, in groups, a silent but powerful message of unity. And slowly, the town began to come back to life. Shops reopened, parks filled with laughter again. It was as if a shadow had been lifted, a long-held breath finally released. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, an unexpected but respected leader. She organized community meetings, potluck dinners, anything to bring people together. And at every gathering, Evelyn was there, a quiet but constant presence, always ready with a word of advice or encouragement. It was at one of these gatherings, a barbecue in the town square, that the news came. A hush fell over the crowd as the sheriff stepped up, his face grave. "I've just received word," he said, "that Raven and several of his top men have been arrested. They're being charged with a litany of crimes, from assault to extortion." A cheer went up, relief and joy palpable in the air. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, the weight of months of fear finally lifting. Evelyn was beside her, a hand on her shoulder. "You did this," she said softly. "Your courage, your determination. You've changed this town." Sarah shook her head. "We did this. All of us, together." Evelyn smiled. "Yes, we did. And that's something the hellhounds never understood. There's strength in unity, in compassion. That's a power they could never touch." As the celebration swelled around them, as laughter and music filled the air, Sarah felt a swell of pride. This was her town, these were her people. And together they had faced the darkness and won. But she knew the journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more fears to face. But now they had the tools, the strength, the unity. Now they were ready for whatever came next. The old warehouse on the outskirts of town had long been a place of shadows, of whispered tales and dark rumors. It was here, in this cavernous space of rusted metal and shattered glass, that the remnants of the hellhounds gathered. They were a sorry sight, a far cry from the swaggering, intimidating gang they had once been. Defeat hung heavy on their shoulders, bitter on their tongues. In the center of the group, Maverick paced, his eyes wild, his fists clenched. He had been Raven's right hand, his enforcer. With Raven gone, locked away behind bars, leadership had fallen to him. It was a burden he wore poorly. "We can't let this stand," he snarled, his voice echoing in the empty space. "We can't let them win." The others shifted uneasily, their eyes darting. The fire that had once burned in them, the cruel joy they had taken in their power, had been doused. "What can we do?" one of them asked, his voice thin and reedy. "The whole town's against us now. We've got nothing left." Maverick whirled on him, his hand shooting out, grabbing the man by the throat. "We've got our pride," he hissed. "We've got our vengeance. And that's enough." He released the man, shoving him back. The others drew away, fear and uncertainty in their eyes. "We'll show them," Maverick said, his voice low and deadly. "We'll show them what happens when you cross the hellhounds." He stalked to the corner, ripping away a tarp to reveal a cache of weapons, guns, knives, brass knuckles. The sight of them, cold and deadly in the dim light, sent a chill through the room. "We hit them hard," Maverick said, picking up a gun, running his fingers along the barrel. "We hit them where it hurts. We make them regret ever standing up to us." In the town square, Sarah stood before the community, her voice ringing with passion. "We've come so far," she said, her eyes shining. "We've shown what we can do when we stand together. But our work isn't over. We have to stay vigilant, stay united. We have to keep looking out for each other." The crowd nodded, a murmur of agreement rippling through them. "Remember," Sarah continued, "our strength isn't in violence or intimidation. It's in our compassion, our unity. It's in the small acts of kindness we show each other every day. That's what will keep us strong, keep us safe." As the crowd dispersed, buoyed by Sarah's words, Evelyn approached. But her face was grave, her posture tense. "Sarah," she said quietly, "we need to talk." In the dim light of Evelyn's living room, the truth came out. Evelyn had received word from her old military contacts. Maverick was planning something big and violent. Sarah felt fear clutch at her heart, but she pushed it down. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice steady. "We can't let him undo everything we've worked for." Evelyn nodded. "I agree, but we have to be smart about this. We can't stoop to their level, can't resort to violence." They worked through the night, devising a plan, reaching out to allies. And as the sun rose, they were ready. In the town square, the people gathered once more. But this time, they weren't alone. Flanking them were police officers, journalists, even a few state officials who had heard of Oakville's plight. When Maverick and his gang roared into town, weapons drawn, they found themselves facing not just a united town, but a united front of law and order. The confrontation was tense, the air thick with anticipation. But in the end, it was Maverick who backed down, his weapons clattering to the ground in the face of an unassailable force. As he and his men were led away in handcuffs, a cheer went up from the crowd. It was a cheer of victory, of relief, of a battle hard fought and won. Sarah stood at the front, tears streaming down her face. Evelyn was beside her, a steady hand on her shoulder. "You did it," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. "You led them, you inspired them. You showed them what true strength looks like." Sarah shook her head. "We did it," she corrected. "All of us, together." The years passed, and Oakville bloomed. The shadow of the hellhounds faded, becoming nothing more than a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when fear was allowed to fester. But it was also a reminder of what could happen when a community banded together, when they chose compassion over cruelty, unity over division. Sarah grew both in years and in wisdom. She went to college, studied social work, determined to dedicate her life to helping others. And whenever she returned to Oakville, she was greeted with warmth and respect, the town's beloved daughter. Evelyn remained a constant presence, a pillar of quiet strength. She became a mentor to many, sharing her wisdom, her resilience. Under her guidance, the town flourished, becoming a model of what a community could be. There were challenges, of course. There always are. But Oakville met them as they had learned to together, with open hearts and unwavering resolve. And at the center of it all, a simple message, a profound truth that had been forged in the crucible of their struggle. There is no greater strength than the strength of compassion. No greater power than the power of unity. In the face of darkness, in the face of fear, these are the lights that guide us home. These are the bonds that cannot be broken. Oakville had learned this lesson, had etched it into their very souls, and they would never forget it. As Sarah stood on the stage at her college graduation, her cap and gown billowing in the warm spring breeze, she looked out over the sea of faces. Her mother, her friends, her neighbors, all there to support her, to celebrate with her. And in the front row, Evelyn, her eyes shining with pride. Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She had been asked to give the commencement address, to share her wisdom with her fellow graduates. She had thought long and hard about what to say, about what message she wanted to impart. And in the end, she had realized that it all came down to one simple, powerful truth. "We are stronger together," she began, her voice ringing clear across the auditorium. "Stronger than we ever could be alone. This is the lesson I learned, the lesson my town learned, in the face of great darkness." She spoke of the hellhounds, of the fear and intimidation they had wrought. But more importantly, she spoke of the courage, the unity, the compassion that had overcome them. "It wasn't easy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was scary and hard, and there were times when we wanted to give up. But we didn't. We stood together, we stood for each other. And in the end, that made all the difference." As she spoke, she could see the faces in the crowd change, could see the realization dawn, the inspiration kindle. "So as you go out into the world," she concluded, "remember this. Remember the power of unity, of compassion. Remember that no matter how dark things may seem, there is always hope, always light, if we stand together." The applause was deafening, a roar of affirmation, of solidarity. And as Sarah looked out over the sea of faces, as she saw the determination, the hope, the love reflected back at her, she knew that Oakville's lesson, the lesson of strength in unity, would endure. It would endure in the hearts of these graduates, in the communities they would build and nurture. It would endure in the very fabric of the world they would shape. And that, more than any personal achievement, more than any accolade, was the true victory. As Sarah stepped off the stage and into Evelyn's waiting embrace, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a deep and abiding contentment. This was what mattered. This connection, this love, this unbreakable bond of community. This was the true strength, and it would never, ever waver.